Howdy, I'm Radical Liberation, self-declared king of the moon, coming at you from St. Louis, Missouri in these United States. Mad Mercenary is busy with something extremely important this week. Prayers appreciated. Good stuff, good stuff. So we have the pleasure of having Pardner Turnip from Oklahoma.
Yeah, good afternoon, Radlib. How are you?
Very good.
Good.
This is worked out really well. Turnip's a little busy, but he was able to squeeze us in. And this worked out really well because the topic has to do with the West. And at least in one part, well, what the West is, it shifts throughout the 19th century, right? Because one part of the article, it talks about Iowa quite a bit, right?
Yep.
Which I think of as, or it's east of me, right? Other parts of the article, it talks about west of Missouri is really a critical key phase. Anyway, point is, Turnip and I both, I guess, are in what was once, the Wild West, right?
Yeehaw.
Yeah. So I think we're going to have some interesting context for what we're going to be learning about today. Before we get into the main topic, a couple typical things for us to cover. First of all, we are not exploiting Subscribestar as well as we could. So I am going to try to change that. How do I see? There we go. Yeah. Okay. So someone made a good point. I always thought of Subscribestar as just for subscriptions. And we have a number of people who are subscribed and supporting us, which is really helpful. It literally, I think I don't even give you an option except to do $5 a month. You can't even give me more as a regular subscription. So it's really cheap way to support the show. And that really counts for a lot because then we can kind of plan. We have some steady income for the channel and plan on improvements. We have improvements we are trying to make that will need money. Production values, right? But also, I did not think about it this way. Subscribestar can be used for super chats, essentially. They're called tips on Subscribestar. But we have a couple people, I think it was Ike Broflovsky, that particularly made a point of demonstrating and telling us that you could do tips on Subscribestar. Big advantage of that is it's a smaller slice that's taken by the Subscribestar platform, and it's not Google taking it.
I also assume if it's on Subscribestar, I assume it's not bound to the show either. So would it be possible to say leave a tip on Monday and then come to the show on Thursday?
That's an interesting idea. Yeah, that's true. You don't have to do it during the show if you don't want to. I'm going to see them. So anyway, I am making the public commitment here that in addition to checking super chats at the end of the show, I will also be checking for tips on Subscribestar. So that is a totally legit and for many of us probably a preferable way to donate and ask a question or make a comment or whatever. Okay, so having said that, merch store, just wanted to mention that. Mad Merc has put up some new designs recently, extremely cool. The especially spicy one is on its way still. We'll see if he has the guts to actually use the original quote. Those Spanish monks, they were spicy. And then what else did I want to say? Merch store, and I had notes of what I wanted to cover. Here we go. Yeah. Okay. So, sorry. Inflation watch. That's the other thing to do. This is not a minis week, so we're not going to do a bunch of current event stuff. But I did, just because it does seem to be interesting what's happening. I did want to briefly highlight a chart here. This is the Consumer Price Index. As we discussed recently, the Consumer Price Index is certainly flawed from our point of view. It understates it understates true inflation, we suspect, leaving out assets and a number of other things to some degree in an attempt to make it not look as bad as it is. Having said that, when there is a bad inflation, the CPI does go up. I mean, a bad price inflation, the CPI does reflect it. Maybe not as much, the magnitude isn't quite right, but you do see movement upward, and that the corrupt price index, Aranje says, absolutely. So you do see, it's a little hard to see at the end, that sort of yellow portion. You do see a spike up quite recently in the CPI. So we will be keeping an eye on this. And of course, send me your best lumber memes because they're just so funny. Okay, so that's that. And the other thing to share, sorry, do the screen sharing thing here real quick. Oh, not that way. Avoid the infinite window. Okay, here we go. Sorry, I've found it difficult to line things up for sharing on the show ahead of time with this interface. That will be better eventually. Okay, here we go. So this is a book. We're not going through this book today. We're going through the original article, which was expanded into this book. So the book is called The Not So Wild Wild West, Property Rights on the Frontier, and the article's title is quite similar. And it is by the original authors of the article, which was published in the 70s. I'm forgetting which year exactly, 74, something like that, by Terry Anderson and Peter Hill. And so I wanted to let you know that's available and share the link with you, just in case you find this interesting. I actually read some Louis L'Amour when I was young, if you've ever heard of him. A park ranger turned me on to Louis L'Amour, and I found his Westerns really enjoyable. If you sort of find that interesting, the stories of the frontier and stuff like this, and you have an interest in, understanding how the world works and economics and stuff like that, then this book might be one for you. If you enjoy the show and want to know more, this is definitely the place to go. So that's particularly why I wanted to mention it. Okay, now let me make sure I have my article up. I'm preparing for multiple things because, oh yeah, I guess I should mention that. I'll be on Cigar Stream tomorrow. So I'm scrambling to prepare for that also. And we'll be discussing a very important piece from the 1500s by Etienne de la Boétie. Sorry, trying to practice my French that my wife taught me. And it's the discourse of voluntary servitude, and it's about basically why do people obey? Why do we essentially allow ourselves to be, essentially enslaved by states? In his case, he's focusing on tyrannical states, but it is a very interesting essay tomorrow that we'll be talking about, and it fits in very neatly with a number of things that Academic Agent has been thinking about lately. And so I strongly recommended to him that we cover this material together.
Sounds like it'd be a tough challenge to find a state today that wouldn't be considered tyrannical.
Right, but let me be clear. Once you grasp what Boétie has to say, then you realize that it has broad application, shall we say. So anyway, a little teaser on that. I recommend the Cigar Stream series in general, and of course, I'll be on it tomorrow with Academic Agent and covering a topic I think you'll find really spicy and interesting, radical in the most radical way you can imagine. Okay, so right, did I share the? No, I haven't done that yet. Okay, so let me just grab the article. I don't know if it helps to have these things up on screen. Like, can you even see it? I don't know. But here's the, actually, let me jump to the bottom, just give you the original title. This was originally published in the Journal of Libertarian Studies as an American experiment in anarcho-capitalism, the not so wild, wild west. And then it was expanded into the book that I showed you. And it was, I don't know, when it was in the JLS, when Murray Rothbard was editing the Journal of Libertarian Studies, I believe. But it's, let's see, prepared the material in 77, 78. So anyway, probably published around 1979 or something, this article. And I was not going to dwell, Turnip, too much on some of the early bits where they're really talking about political theory and stuff like that.
Yes, defining anarchy or chaos. And
yeah. Because, well, let me explain why. In fact, tomorrow, if you want to hear sort of anarchist theory, that might be more the show for you. What I wanted to do, because this has sort of been the way this show has been, as it's been finding its stride, this has been the focus, is that it's been more historical and empirical, right? I am teaching theory. That's what I want to do, but I want to do it in a way that feels grounded in real life. And so what interests me about the material we'll be covering here is not exactly that, not so much the theory of it, but the practical realities of how people handled the situations they found themselves in at the time. What were the actual mechanisms they did? So we'll nod towards theory here and there, but really I'm interested more in praxis today. I want us to see what they did. What did they do in this environment, which we know was unusual. I think we'll learn in this article that we've been given very much the wrong idea about the frontier, what happened on the frontier. But it certainly was an unusual time in a lot of ways, an unusual situation for society to function, right? And so how did it function? How did they actually work? How did these Europeans heading out into sort of the unknown of this huge continent? By the way, let me just mention, if you haven't traveled, Turnip, then you may not realize how big the United States is.
I have an appreciation for that because my family has taken me out to quite a few places. I have family in Alabama, so like we drove all the way over there, and just from that relatively short length compared to like other trips you can take across the US, right. Like I remember the first time I was like, wow, this is a lot of land.
Right. Well, that's not exactly what I meant. I didn't mean travel domestically. I mean, if you go back to where we came from, Europeans came from, European civilization came from, which I have, and you go to the city of London, 1 square mile, inside of which is Parliament and like Big Ben and all the things you've heard of, it's in 1 square mile, and so on and so forth. You go to these places you've heard of, and then you like walk across them, and you're like, that's it. Okay, wow. Like it looms so large because it's of such genuine significance to us as European people, right? It's our history, it's where we came from, it's where our institutions, our ideas, our culture, our language, it all comes from Europe, right?
Yes.
And so it's big, and it was big in my mind. And then I went there and I was like, well, it is big, but it's tiny. So if you ever see those maps where they take like an American state and put it on top of Europe, like what if you took Texas, put it on top of Europe? Really worth looking at those if you ever get a chance. It kind of gives you an idea. But for me, it was the act of actually traveling to Europe, especially the first time. That's when it first hit me, obviously, most strongly. And just going, oh, wow, the scale of Europe is completely different. It's not like 10% less. It's different enough that it's on a different, it had, when a quantitative difference becomes a qualitative difference, if you follow me.
Yep.
Right. Yeah. So Europe is small. So when we talk about the West and how it was, as they focus here on the period from 1830 to 1900. So the frontier is actually moving throughout the 19th century, right?
Yes. Yes.
When the frontier moves, it doesn't move like 10 miles. It moves like hundreds of miles, right? Yeah. So these are big movements over 1830 to 1900. We're going to be ranging across time and place as we talk about this. Please don't picture these things as down the street from each other, because that is not true. That is not at all true. Using modern, as Turnip was just sharing, using modern transportation, it's a journey to go from one part of the Old West to another part of the Old West, or one frontier to another. Back then, with horses and wagons and stuff, I mean, you're taking your life in your hands just because the journey itself is difficult, right? Never mind, being attacked or something, right? Okay, so anyway, America's really big. Okay, so I'm gonna skip some of the theory here, and I want to very quickly. Oh, there is one theory, a bit of theory I wanted to explain because they're going to mention it more than once, and so we just need to get it out of the way. A Schelling point. It's also called a focal point. This is something that comes from game theory. I'm not real big on game theory myself. I studied it when I did my graduate study. It's never factored heavily into how I think about the world. Let's put it that way. It's not. I've not found it to be a strong analytical tool, and maybe that shows that I just don't get it or something. I don't know. But I think the Schelling point seems relatively useful if you think about it broadly. The Wikipedia definition says a focal point or a Schelling point. It's a solution that people tend to choose by default in the absence of communication. So they gave a really good example of this. So here's a game. You're not allowed to communicate with each other. You will win an award. You'll get $100 if you do the same thing, and you'll get nothing if you don't. Okay, so two people, you don't know each other, you're in separate rooms. Here's the puzzle. Ready? Give an order to the letters A, B, and C. Okay, well, there's a good chance the two players are going to win the $100, right?
Right, yeah.
Right. Here's one more. It's the split money game. Two players share $100. They first write down their individual claims on a sheet of paper. If their claims add to $100 or less, both of them will get exactly what they claimed. But if the sum is higher than $100, they get nothing. Mm-hmm. What are you going to pick, right? Without any communication, just knowing those rules, what are you going to do, right?
Right.
So that's a Schelling point or a focal point. They use the term Schelling point in the article. And so they say there was points of commonality that existed in the minds of the people in this social situation. So even in the absence of any enforcement mechanism, a state, basically, right?
Yep.
The state was, obviously the United States existed in 1830 to 1900, but I think it's fair to say, Turnip, that depending on where you were on the frontier, it was a bit irrelevant to your day-to-day life, right?
With most of the stories that I have, that's going to be that's going to be like the foundation. You've heard of the government, but most of the time you have never seen it nor heard from it.
Right.
At all.
Yeah, and it's worth mentioning, the United States is extremely different. It's been, Teddy Roosevelted and Lincolnized and Wilsonianized and FDRized, right? This is quite a different experience of government than would happen, say, before the war between the states, when there was the postman who was an employee of the U.S. federal government, as I understand it. That was always the case. Mm-hmm. There'd be a local post office. But other than that, the federal government in particular was extremely irrelevant to most people's lives, Americans' lives, right?
Yep.
And so and I'm talking about if you lived in Boston or New York, it was extremely irrelevant to your lives. Now, take what I just said and imagine being on the frontier. It is super irrelevant to your life, right? So anyway, so even in the absence, so picture yourselves in essentially an anarchic position, right? The government exists over there somewhere, but it really has little to do with how you day-to-day function as a society. But what do you have? You have the Schelling point, namely, most members of Western society agreed that certain rights to use and control property existed. For example, now lots of other things we could bring up, right? Cultural commonalities that Europeans have, Christianity, right? But here's a basic one in terms of just being able to cooperate together socially, and that is views on property. So thus, when a miner argued that a placer claim was his because he was there first, mm-hmm. that claim carried more weight than if he claimed it simply because he was bigger than you and could beat you up or whatever, right?
Right. Yes.
Right. So there's just these norms that, even if they weren't stated, it was just in everybody's head culturally.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
And that was that was during the gold rush in California. That was known not because it's like invented by them. That was just known as the Mexican system because the United States had a different law about claiming like actual mining land. And the Mexicans had the more rational of the laws by the sounds of it because it was just, I started mining this first, it's mine.
Mm-hmm.
the United States system had a whole bunch of other requirements that we'll get into later.
Okay, now just to throw some raw meat to the ethnats, I'll read this out. The long period of conflicts between the Indians, the Native Americans, and the settlers can be attributed to a lack of any such Schelling points. But they just mentioned that in passing because this article is about how arrangements were made between the non-Indigenous white, or I would say European population, right? So we're going to talk about how the Europeans dealt with each other. The issue of how they didn't reach a sort of they didn't have those common points with the Native Americans is a whole different topic, and we're not going to try to handle that today. It's enough to understand how how the cowboys work it out, right? That kind of thing. Okay, so there is a little bit more theoretical machinery to throw in real quick, just so that we understand what we're looking for as we go through the case studies. Okay, so although for much of the period, formal government agencies for the protection of rights were not present, such agencies were always lurking in the background. Therefore, none of the private enforcement means operated entirely independent of government influence. So they're not arguing that this is like a pure case of, we have proven that anarchy works or something. They're just saying it's as we were just describing, the role of the state is very distant, very kind of vague, irrelevant in a lot of ways. And so they did have to do some on-the-ground organizing, and that's what we're going to learn about today. And I think you will find it not only interesting historically, but perhaps relevant to some various projects we have. Now, this is interesting. I'm so used to everybody going off of Rothbard for anarchy stuff. They actually go off of another book, which I've read, and it's good, by David Friedman, the son of Milton Friedman, called The Machinery of Freedom. And it is a book about anarchy, but he sort of comes at it from a different point of view. And he's very much focused on sort of mechanisms, how does the society function? So here are the major propositions they tease out from David Friedman's book. Anarcho-capitalism is not chaos. Property rights will be protected and civil order will prevail. So the usual assumption is anarchy has this secondary meaning, well, depending on who you are. Anarchy, in my mind, has the primary meaning in political theory of not having a state, right? Not having a monopoly government, I should say, is the precise definition of it. But in most people's minds, anarchy has this strong second, almost primary meaning of chaos, right? That's because it's assumed that without a monopoly state, that's all you'll have. Well, David Friedman predicts that that's not the case. That in anarcho-capitalism, you won't have chaos. Property rights will be protected. You will have civil order. It won't just be Lord of the Flies time, right?
Yes, and this will bear out with what we're going to show today.
Yeah. Secondly, private agencies will provide those functions that are actually needed. Now, I talk about it, but you can classify, Rothbard has classified the role the state does in a couple buckets. One is things that society would do anyway, and the state has just sort of taken it over, right? There is that the state does that would not happen without the state existing. Generally wouldn't be a thing because societies would see no point in doing such a thing, right? So here we're talking about that first bucket where there are some things that the state has taken over, but they are legitimate social functions. It's just the state decided to say, we will be the ones who monopolize this or decide how it's done or whatever. Friedman is saying private provide those necessary functions that you need to preserve an orderly society. Thirdly, these private protection agencies will figure out quite quickly that warfare is a costly way of resolving disputes, and they will move to arbitration and courts and stuff like that, rather than just immediately going to fighting, because that's what a lot of people picture. They're like, without the government there, I just go over and shoot my neighbor right now. It's like, would you? Are you sure? Because I could see some bad results of doing that, about it for a second, and you just might, before you just walk over and go, oh, the US government collapsed yesterday, so today I'm going to just start mowing down my neighbors. Nothing will go wrong, Well, people actually are a little more rational than that, believe it or not. And this really a through line I want to catch as we go through this. Significant differences in rules might exist in various societies under anarcho-capitalism. I think this is an area that feels uncomfortable for a lot of us, but it's something that we need to get used to if we're going to have something besides the tyrannies we live under. That is, humans produce organic, and it's not necessarily reasoned from first principles, and it is by culture and history. So laws, and as you go from a natural society to another natural society, are going to look a little bit different. Now, C.S. Lewis in The Abolition of Man demonstrated that the Tao, he called it, has been there throughout all history. There's certain things that all societies end up honing in on, don't steal, don't murder, kind of the 10 Commandments type of stuff, right? Having said that, the way that you enforce prohibitions against theft is going to look a little bit different, right? Punishment will be different. How the court system works is going to be different. A big lesson to draw today is that's okay. Calm down. We don't all have to be exactly mirror images of each other. True diversity, right? Diversity, that the preachers of diversity, that is a genuine diversity of societies that function in their own ways, right? And that are human and organic. So fifth, Friedman argued there's not enough significant economy in crime, so he doesn't foresee major mafia organizations evolving and dominating society. And then along similar lines, number 6, competition among protective agencies will serve as a check on undesirable behavior, and consumers will have better information than under states and will use it in judging those agencies. So keep all that in mind, all those 6 points in mind as we go. All right, so yeah, I don't want to beat this to death. We all know histories and movies, especially this era that we're talking about, as characterized by gunfights, horse thievery, general disrespect for basic human rights. I mean, kind of the image I have in my mind, I know that I'm thinking of a particular film or anything, the image I have in my mind, in the Old West, you could just walk into a bar and gun somebody down and everyone would just go back to playing cards. Right?
Yeah. Walk into like a brothel or something, shoot the ceiling, and then start doing something else. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And everyone's just like, oh, none of my business. I'm going to go back to what I'm doing.
Yeah.
So if you think, I mean, I say it in a way I'm making fun of it because it is silly, right? If you really think through these scenarios in like real life, imagine like really being there, right? That's not how people generally function. Now, having said that, I'm thinking about all the cases where I'm seeing people taking videos of someone being beaten and they're just sitting there faithfully camming it as opposed to like intervening in the beating, So that's a little confusing for me. But anyway, I think by and large, they paint a cartoonish and unrealistic picture of how people are when they try to show West. So it already should feel kind of wrong. If you really think through it, don't treat it as like a movie fantasy, but imagine actually being there at that bar where the guy comes in, just shoots somebody down, and this is your town, this is your community. And that guy you just shot down is like your neighbor, right? I mean, think about it, right? So in contrast though, they say recent examinations have found that doesn't seem quite right. So they talk about a book by a guy named Eugene Holland, Frontier Violence, Another Look. And he says the Western frontier was a far more civilized, more peaceful, and safer place than American society is today. Now, when I say that it's a safer place than American society is today, I feel like that probably had a lot more punch in the 70s. Whereas right now people are like, yeah, that's probably true, right?
Yeah. I can't think of any Wild West cities that just got burnt down because of a riot just in the summer, casually, no repercussion at all.
Right. And then they say 5 of the major cattle towns, Abilene, Ellsworth, Wichita, Dodge, well, from the years 1870 to 1885, that's 45 homicides were reported. Now, that's not 45 homicides per cattle town per year.
Mhm.
That's 45 homicides for 15 years in these 5 major cattle towns that
Yep.
probably have had more people killed in Hollywood set in those towns than ever actually died during those years, right?
Yes.
I'm sure a lot more than 4 people have been gunned down in Hollywood, Dodge City, you know?
Yeah.
So that comes up to an average of 1.5 homicides per cattle trading season across all those towns, right? So
Yeah,
this is
and
the chaos. And imagine a weekend in Chicago, say, which might like all those 15 years put together into one Chicago weekend, right? In terms of homicide numbers. Go ahead, sir.
That point, I don't know. I don't really remember if they carry it on later. That's going to tie in with the Chisholm Trail, which I was hoping to bring up, because these cowboys, these cattle ranchers, cattle drivers rather, kept remarkable order.
Okay, well, let's wait on that because I think the cowboy section.
Okay, all right.
One of the case studies, because we'll just look ahead real quick. There's
awesome.
Cattlemen's Associations is the second case study.
So
let's save it for that. Okay, one more thing. In Abilene, supposedly one of the wildest of the cow towns, nobody was killed in 1869 or 1870. In fact, nobody was killed until the advent of officers of the law employed to prevent killings. Interesting. Only 2 towns, Ellsworth in 1873 and Dodge City in 1876, ever had 5 killings in any one year. Again, I reference any weekend in Chicago as a modern comparison point, and I don't say that lightly. It's absolutely tragic and horrible, and we should put an end to it with the kinds of things we're going to learn today.
Yes.
So let's see. One last thing. He just gives a taste of what we're going to be getting into. Vigilance committees, Vigilantes, right? It comes from vigilance committees. These would be put together when, in some cases, when there's kind of no government, or this is interesting, where government was ineffective. So he says, as in the case of San Francisco in the 1850s, or where government became the province of criminals who used the legal monopoly on coercion to further their own ends, as in Virginia City, Montana Territory in the 1860s. So there would be government failure. It wasn't bringing order, or itself was the source of disorder. And then you'd have these vigilance committees spring up. He says, even in these cases, however, violence was not the standard modus operandi. When the San Francisco Vigilance Committee was reconstituted in 1856, the group acted for 3 months, swelling its membership to more than 8,000. During this period, San Francisco had only 2 murders, compared with more than 100 in the 6 months before the committee was formed. Let me go over that one more time in linear order. 6 months before the committee was formed, 100 people murdered. They formed the vigilance for getting out of hand in San Francisco. And for the next 3 months, there were 2 murders. So, government versus private enforcement of order. Hopefully this is opening your mind to possibilities. Okay, here's our case studies that we're going to hit today. And yeah, we have time. We're doing great. Land claims clubs, cattlemen's associations, mining camps, and wagon trains. That's what the article covers. We'll see if Turnip comes up with something else beyond those 4. But let's get through these 4 first. So land clubs. Right. So this is the classic situation, right? Land squatting. These marginal or frontier settlers, squatters as they were called, were beyond the pale of constitutional government. No statute of Congress protected them in their rights to the claims they had chosen and the improvements they had made. In law, they were trespassers. In fact, they were honest farmers. Okay, stop right here, Turnip. What's going on? Why are they out there, and why is there no way for them to legally claim the land? I don't understand the legal context.
So this goes back a while, and it depends on when you're talking about, but this is the case basically until Congress passes an act and says, all right, you can go here now. I'm going to give you all a very scary thought to think about, just if we're looking at it from the modern perspective. All this land that we got out west, the Louisiana Purchase, the land we got from Mexico, and in the Northwest ordinances before, right after the Revolutionary War, what happened to all of that land once we finally got it? It wasn't just put in the hands of private owners and suddenly people were out there and farming. Right. It was in the hands of the government until they gave it to someone, which is a terrifying thought now that the United States government directly owned the majority of this country. So,
okay, wait. I got to stop you right there because it's finally time. I'm going to make a video about it at some point. Just haven't gotten around to it. It's finally time to explain my joke about being self-declared king of the moon. It is in reference to what Turnip just said. That is exactly why I keep making that joke. It's because in libertarian property acquisition theory, Lockean theory, right? Yes. The idea is that you go and you actually like do something useful, and people recognize, oh, he's taken that raw land, he's made an improvement on it. Think about our show last week, right? Yes. He has improved the environment, right? He's taken some land that was, let's say, a field, right, that for farming. It had a bunch of rocks in it. It had a bunch of stumps. He got those rocks out. He got those stumps out. He plowed it. He made it into something that can produce food for himself and the community, right? Everyone's like, you, sir, you own that land now. We respect you, right? We respect your claim because you really put some blood, sweat, and tears into this. You're doing something useful with it, right? So that is the right way to acquire property. Here's the wrong way. It's the joke I make. I'm the king of the moon. Why should you respect that? Because I said so. Right. Well, that's exactly what the United States federal government did with the West. And I don't know if you've seen the map that shows the federal ownership, Turnip, but to this day, there are massive amounts of land. Like a couple European countries, decent sized European countries could fit into the land in the West that the federal government still owns. So they have claims it owns. Right. So in my view, before God, by natural right, however you want to put it, they do not own that land. They just say they own it as much as I'm the king of the moon. Yes. Okay. So that's the big joke about the king of the moon. It's in reference to this kind of crap. So go on.
And like Bradley was saying, that's not to say they were doing anything with it. They just said they own it. So what if I am a farmer that, say, just fought in the Revolutionary War to go settle out west, and Congress already says, no, we own that, you can't go do that. I'm going to go do that and build my farm. Congress finds out, and if they want the land, they're not going to stop themselves, with the legal process, trying to confiscate that land from me. So I am technically a squatter on that land, even though I have developed it. And this is how we get the United States system with the homesteading acts, that the land becomes yours after you improve it in the eyes of Congress for 5 years and live on it.
Was that a sort of a lagging thing? That is, it was kind of happening and the law was just sort of an acknowledgement of reality? Well, is that how that went down?
It's what happened when we settled the land that we got from England in the Revolutionary War. But this was made in I believe the concept was in the 1850s and finally instated in the 1860s. So a lot of land outlets yet to be developed. The United States government...
the Homesteading Act is very late then, because not only everything that happened, with the War of Secession from Great Britain, but then this whole period we're talking about starts in 1830. And so you're saying like 30 years later, Congress is like, yeah, okay, you can have land if you improve it, right? And they're basically, from my point of view, right, they're acknowledging reality and natural right and saying, okay, we'll start approval on what you guys have been doing anyway, which was the right thing to do, let's face it. Right?
So that works for the eastern side of the Mississippi and the lands immediately surrounding it on the west. There is at the point that they pass this, there is a lot of land in the Great Plains that is yet to be settled. So this is they're saying that to the people that have already settled, but to the people that haven't already settled, they're also saying, if it's not improved in our eyes, we're just going to come and take it and repossess our property, quote unquote. So it's a double-edged sword.
It basically, you're saying west of the Mississippi, it gives them extra eminent domain powers, because they basically say, well, it was really ours all along because we said we're king of the moon, right?
And we don't like what you did with the land. So
right. And so just from a natural rights point of view, I would say it allows the U.S. federal government to be extremely abusive west of the Mississippi, right? They can just go, we want to put a railroad here. Sorry, buddy. We're just taking your land, et cetera, et cetera, right?
Which is exactly what they did, and the land surrounding the railroad. Not just the railroad, but for miles outside of the land. They just gave it to their backed monopoly and said, here, you can have this.
Yep. Even if people were there and had been there for, at that point, potentially decades and decades, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So this is the United States legal way of claiming land. The Mexican Empire, if you wanted to own land, the way that you got that land was you went, or like say I'm going for mining. The way that they recognize that you own that land is you're mining on it. That simple. That like you are you are doing something to the land, you own it now.
Right. So they're much closer to a Lockean idea of acquiring property, basically. Their law, yeah.
Yes. So that's the difference. And when most of the settlers went out to California in the late 1840s and the early 1850s, when they were discovering multiple veins, so not just the big years, the 49, 48, not just that, it continued. They defaulted to using the Mexican system and not the United States system.
And by they, you don't mean the officials, you mean the people.
The people, yeah. There weren't many officials out there. Very few until it was just ending.
So because people basically were like, if you improve it, they in practice, they acted like they were under that Mexican law in essence, right?
Well, and they didn't necessarily even know the Mexican law. That would be a shelling point. You worked the land, you own it.
Yeah, because we just naturally recognize that seems fair or just or something like that.
Yes, right? They weren't like the United States government. They're like keeping track for 5 years. You built this house, an outhouse. You built a farm. I guess it's improved.
Yeah, right. Okay, right. So that's the situation into which we get these extra legal organizations. These land clubs or claims associations, as the extra legal associations came to be known, were found throughout the Middle West. And this is interesting for those who are history geeks. I'm suspecting Turnip knows this name. Frederick Jackson Turner is a really key name that comes up when you study American history of the West in particular, I think. And it says to Frederick Jackson Turner, these squatters associations provided an excellent example of the power of the newly arrived pioneers to join together for a common end without the intervention of governmental institutions. So that's really interesting. I don't think Turner was an anarchist. I never heard he was. But he's seeing them doing what we would call anarchistic type activity, right? And he sounds like he's speaking pretty positively about it, right?
If I remember correctly, I think he was a progressive because he viewed moving out west as like the civilizing process, bringing democracy and morals and all of that. So more from his point of view.
Yeah. So what did these things look like? They would have a constitution, these land associations. Mm-hmm. They would have, he described some of the officers of one of the Claim Association of Johnson County, Iowa. In addition to president, vice president, and clerk and record, that constitution provided for the election of 7 judges, any 5 of whom could compose a court to settle disputes, and for the election of 2 marshals charged with enforcing rules of the association. So I hope already you're getting the idea. This is the Wild West. It's reminding me of the great sketch in Monty Python's Holy Grail, where the guy's digging in the mud or whatever, and he says, King Arthur says, "I am your king," and he says, "You're not our king. We don't recognize you as our king," you know. And then he goes into this hilarious spiel about how I don't remember the lines, but you know, we're a multi consensual society based on these kind of rules, you know. And the king's just like, "Shut up," you know. As he goes into like the details of how they function, right? I mean, this might be why Hollywood doesn't tell us about this stuff. I don't know that it makes great film to talk about, you know, let's see now, do we have 5 judges to settle this dispute according to the constitution of the local claim association? I don't know that makes great drama, right?
Yeah.
But what it does make is a society that functions without the state.
Yeah, right? I don't think Hollywood would sell as many admissions into their theaters if they were making movies about the actual Wild West, which resembles much more of a private law society than it does like Coffeyville, Kansas, where you still have bullet holes in the in a couple of the buildings from a one incident.
Right, the Land Association with Brad Pitt. Anyway, so but for those of us who have found it interesting to see how society works, which is what economics, the social sciences, history to some degree is all about, right? I actually do find this interesting, even if it wouldn't make a good movie, because it makes me think about how people organize and how we can organize without the state, even now, right? Mm-hmm. America had a tradition, de Tocqueville commented on it. America had an amazing tradition of just being self-organizing. He said, everybody they have an interest and they make a little club, a chess club or whatever it is, they make a little association and then they start meeting together and doing their thing. That's like a big tradition in America. We don't wait for like somebody to come and tell us it's okay to do something, or, we just do it. Right. So
rightly so.
We don't have to actually wait to do a lot of the things we're going to learn from this. We just do it, praxis, right?
Yes.
So a little more from this to give you a little bit more flavor. Okay, as a sanction against those who would not follow the rules of the Land Association, violence was an option, but the following resolution suggests that less violent means were also used. Resolved that more effectually to sustain settlers in their just claims according to the custom of the neighborhood, and to prevent difficulty and discord in society, that we mutually pledge our honors to observe the following resolutions rigidly, that we will not associate nor countenance those who do not respect the claims of settlers, and further, that we will neither neighbor with them, trade, barter, deal with them in any way whatever. Right? Mm-hmm. So this is, sorry, my mind's gone blank. What do we call it when you stop buying from someone?
An embargo.
Embargo, thank you. This is a community embargo to say, look, we're all settlers out here. It's all informal. None of us have, official blessing of Congress or whatever, right? Mm-hmm. In most of the period we're talking about. So the only way this is going to work is if we all respect each other's, claims and improving the land and so forth. And if you don't, we're just going to shun you, which out in this environment on the edge of the frontier, people who won't cooperate with you, won't sell you tools and food, et cetera, that's a good way to die in some of these places, right? Winter's coming on and the town has turned its back on you. You're in trouble.
So I have a story about this.
Okay.
One of the ranches in Oklahoma, so just keep in mind, like the railways are being built, but it's not everywhere, and that's your main form of transportation. So if you're a ways away, you're going to get anything you have to import, usually from one or two people maybe, or you're making it yourself if you can. So a lot of the ranches that sprung up in Oklahoma and probably also Kansas as well, but I didn't have to take a semester of Kansas history. A lot of the ranches in Oklahoma would act as little trading hubs where you would get a few people that would import them, and then sell them back to people in the area. A method of supply distribution. So
right.
What would happen is that they would make their own money, like for the ranch, for people that worked on the ranch. They would pay them in that, because US dollars aren't going to be worth too terribly much if there's not enough supply of them to go around.
Is this called scrip? SCRIP? Am I using that term right? Do you know?
I don't know.
Okay, I thought that was a term that was sometimes used for sort of like company money. I'll look it up. Anyway, go ahead.
It might be. So these ranches would make their own money, and they would usually have a general store where you could purchase things like tools, different things from blacksmiths, and all of this other stuff. If you, say, acted like it was the Wild West in Hollywood and just walked inside the local tavern and shot someone from the ranch, they would not sell you anything. And now one of your only methods of getting, I don't know, a shovel is gone. So you're screwed, essentially, if something else already hasn't happened because you've murdered someone. So this is how you would deal with things like that. It's not just an embargo. Like, sometimes they would even prohibit you from using the currency that you've been paid in, because they will not accept it from you.
Right. So, yeah. I think I got it right on script. Here, let me read you the Wikipedia, and let's see if you can detect a subtle hint of bias in Wikipedia. which sometimes breaks that neutral point of view. I don't know if you've ever noticed that, that neutral point of view rule. A scrip is any substitute for legal tender. It is often a form of credit. Scripts have been created for exploitative payment of employees under truck systems and for use in local commerce at times when regular currency was unavailable. For example, in remote coal towns, military bases, ships on long voyages, or occupied countries in wartime. So yeah, I think I was using the right term. And it's just hilarious that they do that. But anyway.
Darn, I hate it that my employer paid me so I could get food. Really exploitative.
Right. Okay, so I'm sorry, did you finish that story?
Yeah, it's like that's just a form of embargo that could happen to you that is very total.
Right. So finishing up on land clubs, and we'll keep seeing this theme here. I just wanted to make sure to share this. The constitutions, bylaws, and resolutions of all claims clubs were not alike. And that suggests that preferences among the squatters varied and that there were alternative forms of protection and justice available. Now, one way to view that is it's chaotic. It scares me. The rules aren't consistent. Here's another way to view it. It's competition, right? You get to see what works and what doesn't. You go, they set up their rules that way, and it kind of was a mess, or maybe not a total mess, but it didn't work out as well as it could. So when we set up our rules, we're gonna try to fix that defect that we noticed in that other setup over there, right? Or you've got various land clubs, say, and you pick the one that seems like it's well functioning. And maybe you never even look carefully at the rules. You just see that it works well, and you go, "Yeah, I want to be part of that thing over there. That's working out well for everybody involved." And so you get competition and better rules. Land clubs with better rules are going to outperform other. Anyway, so that's one of the benefits of that diversity. Is that people are trying things out. And but again, don't think of that as we'll all iterate towards the one true set of rules, right? What we'll see is it also allows for adaptability. Sometimes you've just got very different circumstances. And the rules need to be adjusted a bit to different circumstances. Okay. Yeah. Anything else on land clubs before we move?
And just to kind of like visualize that for some people, the rules in Kansas or Nebraska, somewhere along there, would have to be much different than, say, if I'm starting a land club in Utah, where there is people in that state that have been known to shoot wagon trains that would pass through. So the rules for the land club in Utah are going to be much more perhaps defensive than the ones in Kansas or Nebraska, just out of necessity.
Right. Exactly. Okay, well, let's move on to the cowboys. That's one of the biggest things in the Western movies, right?
Yeehaw!
Cattle, driving cattle, dealing with cattle, riding on horses, using lassos, right? So on and so forth. Well, there was something there too, cattlemen's associations. It says early settlement, this is interesting, early settlement actually created few conflicts because, as we emphasized earlier, the United States or the continent is really, really big. And so there was just room, It says there was room enough for all. And when a cattleman rode up some likely valley or across some well-grazed divide and found cattle there, he looked elsewhere for range. It was like, well, there's just so much room. You're using that? Okay, I'll just go over here with my cattle and let them graze over here, It says, but even as early as 1868, 2 years after the first cattle drive, small groups of owners were organizing themselves into protective associations and hiring stock detectives. That's going to be interesting in a moment. So from Lewis Pelzer describes, from successive frontiers of our American history have developed needed customs, laws, and organizations. The era of fur trading produced its hunters, its barter, and the great fur companies. On the mining frontier came the staked claims and the vigilance committees. The camp meeting and the circuit rider were heard on the religious outposts. On the margins of settlement, the claim clubs protected the rights of the squatter farmers. On the ranchman's frontier, the millions of cattle, the vast ranges, the ranches, and the cattle companies produced pools and local, district, territorial, and national cattle associations. So you have different institutions arising to deal with different kinds of businesses and environmental situations, right? So there's sort of a adaptive diversity to each of these situations. So the cattlemen's associations drew up formal rules governing the group, but their means of enforcing private rights was often more violent than the trade sanctions specified by the claims associations. So now we do get into a little taste. It is not fair. I mean, let's not fall off the horse on the other side, right, Turnip? It is not fair to say there's just nothing to the legends of the Old West, that there's just zero. They just completely made it out of whole cloth.
Yeah.
There is something. There was a gunfight in the Old West, right? I mean, it's not like there was none of this. Yeah,
usually and some of the more famous ones, there would be like a very famous outlaw that had maybe 4 or 5 heists that they did, and then they got caught or died or something like that. So it's not rampant, and it's not non-existent. Usually they are rare. Don't get that wrong. It's not like they're usually common. It's just they were rare, and because they were rare, they made legend.
Right, exactly. Yeah, and they probably played well in the press in the East, right?
Yep.
Here's an exciting story from the frontier, right? Yeah. So they tell us about Bill. They don't give us the name. I wish I knew who this guy was. Bill became Montana's first stock detective. He became a hired defender of property rights, and he executed his assignments as well as his quarry with thoroughness and dispatch. So this is dealing with rustlers, right? You've got your cows, and these are, as they mentioned, massive herds of cattle, right, Turnip? The scale is a little hard to comprehend.
Basically, imagine like you're going to take a picture or something of a scene. All that you would see in that frame would just be cattle. And there would be more outside of that, just to provide like a modern perspective. You wouldn't get them in one picture, right? Yeah. Right. It just, as far as the eye can see, the cattle herd,
so I would assume that provided opportunity for somebody to come along over to the edge. They saw where the cowboys were, right? They went over to the other part of the herd, which is not even in sight, and they walk off with some cows, right? Mm-hmm. Well, this is a big problem because you've fed those cows and you've cared for them, and it's expensive, right?
Yeah, so, and you have to pay for their travel as well through Indian territory, which we'll get to in a minute.
Okay, yeah, and so that's where you get the stock detective who's going to protect the cattle stock, right? And that's where you get somebody who maybe is a little bit of a tough character like Bill, who you could maybe see being in a little bit of a Hollywood film. It's just, I don't think I remember very many films where his job is just, my job is to protect the cows, and you stole a cow, so I got to hunt you down, I mean, that's probably what some of the violence that really did happen more often is something like that. But I feel like they don't tend to depict that. So although there are numerous records of gunslingers making themselves available for hire, we find no record of these gunslingers discovering that it was even more profitable to band together and form a super defense agency that sold protection and rode roughshod over private property rights. So you don't get the formation of, Bill decides, hey, I'm the toughest guy around here. I'm just going to start stealing from everybody and get some cronies with me, and we're just going to be predators on everything, and we're just going to do this for like decades, Mm-hmm. This doesn't really happen. Instead, there were some loose criminal associations, and they seem to be dealt with more quickly and more severely under private property protective associations than under government organization. Anyone who saw my very gruesome post about yet more horrible stuff happening in England can maybe sympathize with a private agency serving some well-deserved justice better than what we sometimes get from the state, right? Yep. Where people do horrendous things, and then everybody's like crying when they see that they got probation or 3 years in prison. And you're the people who were affected by what they did, if they're alive, are waking up with nightmares every night, right?
Yeah.
Well, what he's saying in essence is, the people who did horrible things like that didn't last long in this environment where real justice was being carried out. Go ahead.
There's no legal system which I'll be honest here, has been completely subverted to protect someone that say I'm going to rob a bank or burn down a barn or something like that. And this time, that is a very big deal because you've either just ran off with someone's like very valuable items that have probably been passed down to them through generations, or you've burnt down the like past 5 years of their work plus all the stuff stored inside of the barn. So if I get caught, they are going to hang me from a tree, if not mutilate me before that.
Right.
It's not going to be pretty. They aren't just going to be like, well, the law says we have a maximum, we can hold you for a maximum of 10 years, then we have to let you go on this list of No, you're
good
dead.
Behavior. Yeah. Right. Yeah. So they would make a lesson of you, make an example of you.
Yep.
Right. Yeah. So that people would never want to consider doing such a thing ever again. Right.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, let me read the last part of this, and then I think you have more to say on cattle stuff. Just this last note here. He says there were a few large private enforcement organizations which you could view as, well, aren't these sort of an exception to what you're saying about gunslingers getting together, whatever. And famously, that would be Pinkerton Agency and Wells Fargo. He says, but they served mainly as adjuncts to the government and were largely used in enforcing state and national laws. So when you think the Pinkertons, think Google.
Yes.
If you follow me.
If any of you want to know, the Pinkertons were some of the first people that were hired by the federal government after Lincoln was shot. There was a specific thing. I don't know if it was in pursuit of Wilkes Booth. I remember they were hired basically immediately afterwards, and then they were rarely off the payroll of the federal government. So they very rarely were the Pinkertons hired by other people. No, actually, wait, there was one. They were hired by, I think it was Carnegie once upon a time.
Okay.
I think. It was either Carnegie or Rockefeller, one of the monopolies that were backed by the government. So
right.
By proxy, federal government paying for the Pinkertons again. You don't really, they're expensive. If I'm a farmer or a prospector or something like that, I'm not going to be able to afford the Pinkertons. It's just not happening. So,
right. So they're really a tax-funded agency that's pretty artificial.
Yeah, you can't have them in absence of the federal government.
Right. And they said some state governments as well. But yeah.
Oh, sorry. Well, yeah.
Right.
If they're not in the territories.
If you're not stealing other people's money to pay the Pinkertons, you're not going to be able to afford the Pinkertons, basically, by and large, right? Okay, yeah. So, but you had more to say on the cowboy front, right?
Yes. So,
tell us.
Some of you that are more familiar with, cowboys, the Wild West, and stuff like that, will be aware of the Chisholm Trail. So, after the Civil War, cattle driving was a big thing. This is before you have railroads going everywhere, refrigeration, all this other stuff to really transport large quantities of meat across the country. So the Chisholm Trail was a trail that ran, very basically, for people that don't know what it is, ran from the bottom of Texas all the way up into Kansas and, split off into parts, like had some other trails going into Colorado. I think it reached Missouri just a little bit in the west. But you would have cattlemen that would take, if I remember correctly, tens of thousands of cattle and just drive them all the way up those states into like I believe it was Dodge City was one of the railheads and a bunch of the others. And they would be transported off through the U.S. They were without civilization oftentimes for weeks, but you don't really get that much anarchy in the sense of it's just chaos. You don't get much chaos. That's because these people would keep order because they don't want to die out there. They need to live, and to live, you can't just be out on your own shooting other people just for the fun of it. And something else with this is whenever they would come across like civilization, you've got a pretty big group with you. It's a cattle group. You have to keep all this cattle together to get them to the railroads. So you've basically got a wandering nomad army. But they didn't really impose themselves on other people. Oftentimes, when they came across native villages or places like this, they would negotiate passage with, I believe the common one was like 10 cents a head to pass through. So they respected people's property rights in that sense. Like, you didn't have this wandering army going from Texas to Kansas in what Hollywood would believe you to be in the Wild West fashion, just going into towns and shooting people. They kept order.
And just a real quick note, we're not, like I said, we're not going to get into the relations between the European settlers and the Native Americans in depth today, but I just want to say, and I haven't dug into it deeply, I keep running into things like this where, you know, the stereotype is all Europeans just abuse and shoot Indians as soon as they saw them, you know? And there are some genuine wrong things that happened, in particular by the victorious army after the war between the states, which is particularly horrific what happened after that. And some of the generals who had fought in that war, in fact, were some of the worst mass murderers. Having said that, you go back to, you know, the Puritans coming to America in the first place and stuff like that. And the stories I keep reading, I'm like, this is not the stereotype I've been given of how they're relating. Like, they seem pretty respectful of the Native Americans, you know? So it is, I'm not trying to whitewash anybody. I'm just saying it's a much more complicated and interesting history. And it's a subject worth digging into sometime. But anyway, not going to go further on that rabbit hole today. Go on.
So
the Chisholm Trail, right?
Yeah, that's the point I was trying to make. You basically have what is America's version of a wandering nomadic army, and they weren't chaotic. They kept remarkable order.
They were not raping and pillaging their way across the land. Right?
Exactly, and the people in that, like, if it was found out that you were going to be like a troublemaker, you would not stay once you reached the next town. You were out, and they were finding someone else, because you can't have that attached to you.
Right.
And then if you say mixed up, like, I have this amount of cattle, you have this amount, we mix something up, they would, you know, you're going to resolve that peacefully and say, all right, get back to the original numbers. This is mine. This is yours. They wouldn't just go and shoot each other at high noon to find out whose cattle was whose.
Right. In particular, remember that almost always in real life, you're dealing with repeated interactions, right? So these cattle drives were an annual affair, as I understand it, right?
Yes.
At least annual, maybe more, I don't know, but at least annual. And so what you would be keeping in your mind, the person running this cattle drive, is that you're going to be back through this place next year. And what you don't want is being met with hostile Indians who are pretty pissed off about what you did last year, right?
Yeah,
that's not going to be good for business.
Correct.
Yeah.
And then if you do anything at this point with the Chisholm Trail, it's at the end of the Civil War. And you're at the point now where if you do something very terrible, like, the Rangers are going to be after you. So there is that out there, but that's not what stopped them. Like, I can hear that objection from someone that's defending the orthodox view of the Wild West. That's not what's stopping people. It took those Rangers, months to find one person and defeat them, let alone a giant group of people that's on horseback.
Yeah, again, this is the point to, again, reemphasize the vast amount of territory we're talking about.
Yeah.
Yeah. And the relatively meager presence, even with Rangers, I'm guessing, right? Turnip, relatively meager presence when you consider the amount of people, the amount of cattle, the amount of land. I mean, they're a little drop in an ocean, right?
Yep. And like, the Rangers had trouble dealing with Indians that were on reservations, let alone outlaws that were in the vast expanse of the Great Plains.
Right, could be anywhere, essentially. Yeah. Okay. Anything else on that?
I think I've made that point there.
Okay. Well, let's move on to mining camps then.
All right.
And this is definitely kind of a thinking about Hollywood stuff. It's kind of a genre of its own, a little separate, slightly separate from Wild West, adjacent, right? But the whole thing of, I should have movie titles come to mind, and my mind's going blank. But basically, we found this treasure and now we're fighting over it, or we're transporting this treasure we just found. We dug up all this gold and now we're transporting it, and everybody's trying to kill us. Right. that kind of genre, right? So this is the genre of the gold rush. Where does this begin? Discovery of gold in California is 1848, but, and I did not even know this, the same experience occurred in Colorado, Montana, and Idaho in later years. So there were multiple gold rushes during this Wild West period, right?
Yeah, and I believe Montana would be the one where they had to, and like actually, like at this point, the natives weren't claiming the entire Midwest. They had actually like been pushed back to land that they had developed. The one in Montana, I believe the federal government had to actually, or that might have been the Dakotas, because they found gold in some of the lands that they had actually developed. They had to invade and escort them out so that the government could then take over the land and resell it for money after the Civil War.
Oh, geez.
And then in Nevada, there was also like silver rushes as well.
Oh, okay. Silver rushes too. I hadn't even heard of those. Interesting. Okay, so what's the situation? In each case, the first to arrive were forced into a situation where they had to write the rules of the game. There was no constitutional authority in the country, and neither judge nor officer within 500 miles. 500 miles. Dream. 500 miles is a long way today to travel, right? Well, just imagine no cars, horses as fast as it goes, 500 miles. You might as well be on the moon, right?
It's the dream, I tell you.
So I'll just read a little bit more. This is a fun time in history. The invaders were remitted to the primal law of nature with perhaps the inherent rights of American citizenship, whatever that was worth, out in the middle of nowhere. Every gulch was filling with red-hot treasure hunters. Every bar was pockmarked with prospect holes. Timber, water rights, and town lots were soon to be valuable, and government was an imperative necessity. Here was a fine field for theorists to test their views as to the origin of civil law. So the early civil law, which evolved from this process, approximated anarcho-capitalism as closely as any other experience in the United States. So what happened? Yep. In the absence of a formal structure for the definition and enforcement of individual rights, many of the groups of associates who came seeking their fortunes organized and made their rules for operation before they left their homes. Now, we're going to see this again. That's something else that I wanted us to take away from this. You don't have to just, let's imagine you want to go form a free city or, whatever. What I see of people who are thinking about that right now, people I know, right? They're not just like, well, we'll just go to Guatemala or whatever it is where we want to do this thing, or some island or something. We'll just go there and we'll figure out when we get there. No, everybody's like thinking ahead about it, right? Mm-hmm. Well, of course they are. We're not dumb. So they head out for this, and they talk about, well, what are we going to do? What if we find gold? What if we all are starting to work different parts, and you find gold on your part, and I don't find on my part? Are we going to share it, or is that just yours? Whoever gets lucky, right? I mean, they're going to think through this thing. Traveling out here where they're 500 miles from anything, they're going to have some time, right, to make a plan. They're not just going to be plopped down with a parachute in the middle of a bunch of people mining and go, what do we do now? Right? So what happened, in fact? As Friedman's theory predicts, the rules under which the companies were organized varied according to tastes and needs of the companies. When we compare the rules of different companies organized to go to the mines, we find considerable variation. And there was a detail here that really struck me, because this is another principle that I think a lot of people who have been marred by growing up in democracies don't understand. In addition to the rules listed above, company constitutions often specified arrangements for payments to be used for caring for the sick and unfortunate, rules for personal conduct, including the use of alcoholic spirits, and fines which could be imposed for misconduct, to mention a few. In the truest nature of the social contract, the governing rules of the company were negotiated, and as in all market transactions, unanimity prevailed. So the poison of democracy has us thinking that the way to do things is you force the people who won't go along with the majority to get with it and go with the rule. Well, that's not what we see in the free market and when people freely organize. Unanimity is the general principle. This is always what we see. You go out with a group of friends and we all agree on where we're going to dinner, right? If one of the friends doesn't want to go there, well, we're not going to hold a gun to their head and say, you were going to Lone Star Steakhouse, buddy, or we're gonna plug you, right? They either say, well, you know what, I so dislike that place that I'm just not going tonight, guys, or they opt out. Or more likely, if you're good friends, right, you go, oh, you don't want to go there, Joe? Well, let's talk about some other options that we're all happy with, right? Mm-hmm. That is normal. That is normal.
It's a good way to do things.
It's a great way to do things, and people think it's impractical, and it's not. The only reason you think it's impractical is because you're on the wrong scale. As Don Livingston emphasizes, societies aren't meant to function on the massive scales that we have with the United States. The federal made into one entity United States, post-Lincoln United States, and so forth. These kind of rules work fine if you're on the level of an association of business associates, a family, a town. You can use a lot of these things. When it gets too big, you recognize it's too big and you break it up into smaller pieces. That's normal and healthy.
Yeah.
This thing where 350 million or whatever the heck we have in the United States, people are all going to have to do the same thing because of how the vote came out. And even when the majority supposedly votes in a fortified election, even then, the percentage of people who have actually voted for the winning candidate is not a majority of the people or even a majority of eligible voters. It's really, democracy has just become a minority of people, and everybody else ends up having to go along with it for some reason I can't quite fathom. So anyway, digression there. So what would happen? So they arrive at the gold sites, and then they have, as a company, right? They travel together. You're going to travel together when you're going out into the Old West for 500 miles or more. You travel together and you discuss your arrangements. You get there and you're working together. Well, what about, there's another company that's also there. So when other individuals were confronted in the mining camps, additional negotiations were necessary. The first issue to arise concerned the ownership of mining claims. Mm-hmm. When the groups were small and homogenous, dividing up the gulch was an easy task. When the numbers moving to the gold country reached the thousands, things got complicated, right? So the general solution was to hold a mass meeting. This is interesting. And appoint committees assigned to drafting the laws. And so Gregory Gulch in Colorado gives us an example. A mass meeting of miners was held June 8th, 1859, and a committee appointed to draft a code of laws. This committee laid out boundaries for the district and their civil code. After some discussion, an amendment was, there's that word again, unanimously adopted in mass meeting July 16th, 1859. And this example was rapidly followed in other districts. And the whole territory was soon divided between a score of local sovereignties, sovereignties, they're just little associations, right? Mm-hmm. Now, this is interesting. So these were fairly long lasting, I think, these things that were formed, these camps or whatever. In California, military posts were established to take care of Indian troubles. This is like the Rangers that Turnip was mentioning. But these governmental enforcement organizations did not exercise any authority over the mining camps. Okay. General Riley, in an 1849 visit to a California camp, told the miners that, quote, all questions touching the temporary right of individuals to work in particular localities of which they were in possession, mining claims, right, mm-hmm. should be left to the decision of the local authorities. Meaning, I'm not involved in this, guys. I just deal with Indians. You do your thing. You do you. Let's see. No alcalde. Do you know what that is? This sounds like a Mexican thing.
I actually don't.
Yeah, something for us to learn. Okay, no alcalde, no council, no justice of the peace was ever forced upon a district by an outside power. The district was the unit of political organization in many regions long after the creation of the state. So they're saying that, originally, a lot of these places were not states, and certainly not states that had joined the United States, that had been admitted into the United States. But these mining camps and the organizations they formed continued even after they became an official state. and they had a state government, and so on and so forth.
So, here
so
we
that's
go.
interesting, isn't it?
I have an alcalde in my notes, and it's because I did a paper on George S. Patton, and his family was heavily involved in California, going back quite a while, and I believe he had a grandfather who was an alcalde, and it's basically like a local peacekeeper. So, there you go.
There we go. Okay, and I had teased this on Twitter, but I got to share this. This is just cracking me up. Moreover, the services of trained lawyers were not welcomed in many of the camps, and they were even forbidden in districts such as the Yuning Mining District. So here's their official verbiage. Resolved that no lawyer be permitted to practice law in this district under penalty of not more than 50 nor less than 20 lashes, and be forever banished from this district. Well, why would that be? Well, listen to this. The local camps were able to agree upon rules for individual rights and upon methods for enforcement without coercion from U.S. authorities. When outside laws were imposed upon the camps, there is some evidence that they increased rather than decreased crime. One early Californian writes, "We needed no law until the lawyers came." And another adds, "There were few crimes until the courts with their delays and technicalities took the place of minors." Okay, well, how are we to make sense of this, right? When you have an undifferentiated view of the law, this is extremely confusing. They're against the law? They had no law? Well, no, we understand. They had a naturally developed, organic set of rules that had been working for the community. And then state monopoly law and the way the courts work with the slowness, as they mentioned, and so on and so forth, are brought in to civilize everybody. And the miners are like, you guys are screwing it up. We were doing fine under the rules we had freely formed and agreed to. And you come along and bring your Boston lawyer or whatever, right? And you make a mess of things. Well, that's because there is a diversity of law, and there's a diversity of law not just in what we're talking about, different ways that private communities form laws, but there's a difference and a distinction between private law and laws imposed by monopoly governments.
Yeah.
And you'd expect, right, if you're the king and you tell everybody what the rules are, you're not going to just establish neutral rules that are fair to everybody, including yourself, and put yourself under them, right? You're going to bend the rules a bit to favor yourself and your buddies. And that's why it would bring disorder, right? Because they weren't fair rules that the community. The thing about a good, fair system is that people like it and they feel fairly treated, right? When you start having people come in and twist it up to their own benefit, you start having conflict because people don't like it and they know it's not fair. Even if they can't totally, they're not lawyers. They can't exactly figure out how the game's being played, how the shell game's being played. They can feel that this isn't right. This isn't the way it used to be, right?
Two things here. You can just look back up previously to when we were looking at like the land clubs and all that, how straightforward the rules are written, and then just go look at any law that you have on the public books today and compare it.
Right. Yeah. They tend to be voluminous, as we've learned from congressional laws, right? They're just many, many, many pages. None of our lawmakers actually read this stuff. Only like a Ron Paul or a Rand Paul or something like that would say and be serious. I actually read the 1,000 pages of that bill, and here's what's wrong with it. Everybody else is like, I love kids in my country. I'm voting yes. Right?
Right. And then even then, you can look at things that most lawyers look at the federal rules of evidence. Like if you look at how they word hearsay objections and all of that, you're going to have to reread it a few times to understand what are they talking about. So right. and then you scroll up here and it's like, don't do this, do this. We won't trade with you if you do this. It very straightforward, hard to misinterpret it.
Right.
The second thing, being an Oklahoman and hearing about lawyers coming into somewhere and really screwing things up just royally. After the land rush, 1889, I believe it was, there were a lot of legal disputes because this was the first government supervised land claiming that happened in the or it was the last one at least. There might have been a couple of smaller ones, but this was the big one. Like the U.S. government oversaw the land claims in Oklahoma. This wasn't happening with the Homesteading Act and all of that. So there were a lot of legal disputes between other people and between Indians that could not be resolved privately because the government just said, no, we're overseeing this. You can't do it your way, even though it would be better in every regard. So that means that Oklahoma, that now opened up territory, imports a lot of lawyers, so much so that some towns in Oklahoma at that time have a higher proportion of lawyers to the people living there than any other city in the United States. And most of them are being hired by people like Indians or people like that. They're being screwed over by another of congressional laws that are a bit off topic. But once this happens, you hear about the great land rush, and there's so many like romantic stories written about it. People going out to Oklahoma, racing each other to stake a claim and go to the office. They don't tell you about the next part, which is for the next 15 years, lawyers just sat arguing with each other, hired by people in the territory to just resolve land claims that the government had screwed up in their land management. Surprise, I know.
Right.
And it just screws up a lot of people, including people that had been farming that land for decades prior to the land rush that had just been declared, you don't have that anymore. You're a Sooner. Didn't go at the proper time. Your farm's forfeit.
Yeah, and it's interesting. It's interesting for you to talk about this because I remember first learning about like private arbitration and sort of the theory of private courts and stuff, and I'm like, well, why, if you disagree with each other, would you agree to use the same arbitrator or something, right? Well, I think you're giving us a little clue, right? I mean, like, oh, you mean we can both opt out of dealing with the stupid government system and we can get this resolved without both of us being bled dry by lawyers? Sign me up, right? Like, even if I lose, at least it'll be done. We'll have an answer.
It'll be cheaper.
With our lives. Yeah, right. Yeah, there is a cost to dealing with a super inefficient system like that, a justice system like that. Okay, so let's do a little more on the miners. While the mining camps did not have private courts where individuals could take their disputes and pay for arbitration, they did develop a system of justice through the miners' courts. These courts seldom had permanent officers, although there were instances of justices of the peace. The folk moot system was common in California. By this method, a group of citizens was summoned to try a case. From their midst, they would elect a presiding officer or judge and select 6 or 12 persons to serve as the jury. So it's similar to our idea of calling a jury together. It's just that you do the whole thing from just regular citizens, right? The judge and the jury, they all come just from the populace, right? Most often their rulings were not disputed, but there was recourse when disputes arose. For example, in one case involving two partners, after a ruling by the miners' court, the losing partner called a mass meeting of the camp to plead his case, and the decision was reversed. So that's interesting, right? We already mentioned these mining camps functioned as a little micro society, right? And they agreed to rules. And so they did have a little arbitration that happened, and the guy wasn't happy with it. And so he actually appealed, in this case, just to the whole community, right? It's like we all met together and we agreed on the rules. And now I'm appealing, we all agreed on these rules, and I think I've been screwed and I did it right. And the gathering was like, you're right. You were correct. Let's see. If a larger group of miners was dissatisfied with the general rulings regarding camp boundaries or individual claim disputes, notices were posted in several places calling meetings of those wishing a division of the territory. If a majority favored such action, the district was set apart and named. The old district was not consulted on the subject, but received a verbal notice of the new organization. Okay, so what did we just describe there? We just described a little micro secession, right? And notice how it works. In our world, you only secede if the big, overly sized, non-human scaled political organization that you suffer under allows you to secede, right?
Right.
We will permit you to vote Scotland gets permitted to vote by the United Kingdom or whatever, right? To see if they want to secede. In this case, though, we see what obviously would happen in real life without monopoly governments, without states. And that is, you've got a small group. They don't like the way things are going with the community. And so they say, okay, we're going to take our little section here and we're going to just start a different community. And they don't ask permission. They just let them know out of courtesy. We've broken off and we're setting up our own rules. And these claims over here are going to be part of those rules. Done. No, 600,000 people don't have to die, right? Just to pick a random number.
Right.
Okay, and again, that variation, right? Local conditions making different regulations regarding claims desirable were the chief causes of such separations. The work of mining and its environment and conditions were so different in different places that the laws and customs of the miners had to vary even in adjoining districts. So they might not be breaking off because they think the other people are bad people or something like that. It's just that what we're doing over here, it's kind of a different kind of mining, right? Like I'm just kind of making this up, right? But there's the kind of thing where you're, what's it called? You're in the river and you're
prospecting.
Yeah, you're seeing if there's bits of gold in the river. That kind of thing, right? Yeah. And then there's hardcore, you're down under the ground digging, right? And maybe those different environmental situations just require kind of different rules, right? So it's not that the ones working in the river hate the people that are down in the mine, down underground in the mine. It's just a different set of conditions, and we just kind of need a different set of rules. And we can be adaptable, and we'll have these rules, and you have those rules, and it's no problem. We go our separate ways, right?
It's the equivalent of asking. It's like I live in the swamps of Louisiana. We need different rules than say someone living in Maine or Oregon. Right. We don't need to be bound by the same rules. We do things differently, so we should go. It's just in this case, you don't have some evil entity preventing you from leaving. You have the liberty to abide by rules that you set with other people to best fit yourself. Wow.
Yeah, amazing. It's like rocket science. Okay, so Aranje tempts us and says, I love watching people do prospecting on YouTube. Satisfying. That sounds like a good way to kill some time. Okay. Okay, last thing I wanted to highlight here. Let's see. Okay, I'm probably have to give some context. So in Colorado, there is some evidence of competition among the courts for business, and hence an added guarantee that justice prevailed. But why does he say it's an added guarantee? It's because if a court gets known for being unfair, then people stop bringing their business to the court, right? The civil courts promptly assumed criminal jurisdiction, and the year 1860 opened with 4 governments in full blast. This is in Colorado, 1860. The miners' court, people's courts, and provisional government divided jurisdiction in the mountains, while Kansas and the provisional government ran concurrent in Denver and the Valley. Such as felt friendly to either jurisdiction patronized it with their business. So you could like shop your case, right? Mm-hmm. Appeals were taken from one to the other. Papers certified up or down and over and recognized. Criminals delivered and judgments accepted from one court by another with a happy informality, which it is pleasant to read of. I thought that was nice. And here we are confronted by an awkward fact. There was undoubtedly much less crime in the 2 years this arrangement lasted than in the 2 which followed the territorial organization of Colorado and regular government. That is awkward for some. Yeah, so I think there's a master's thesis or something for Turnip to do if he's out of ideas, and that is a comparison of, pre-state and post-state establishment in the West, right? Yeah. Like, what did it look like? How was crime, as much as we can determine, right? How is crime and social organization and civil order doing in the frontier areas? And then how did that change once they, now we have a real government. Now we've grown up, right? Now we're not just a crazy Wild West territory. Yeah, we've got proper judges. We've got judges and lawyers and a governor, and all that kind of, and democracy, right? Well, I think you can guess what the results might be if Turnip were to do that research, but we would want to do the actual digging, I think, ideally. Okay, so this evidence is consistent with Friedman's hypothesis that when competition exists, courts will be responsible for mistakes, and the desire for repeat business will serve as an effective check on unjust decisions, right? Okay, so anything else on mining camps, sir, before we turn to our final case study in the paper?
I think that I am good.
Okay, well, wagon trains. This is one that really sticks out to me, partially from movies, but actually more from some of those Louis L'Amour novels I mentioned, Westerns, Louis L'Amour Westerns, where, they circle the wagons, and then basically the whole rest of the book is them trying to survive while they're being attacked out in the middle of nowhere with their wagon circled. And that's the book. That's one of his books I remember reading. It's really leaves you, it leaves an impression. So perhaps the best example of private property anarchism in the American West was the organization of the wagon trains as they moved across the plains in search of California gold. So this is the region west of Missouri and Iowa. And so at this time, it was 1848 that California gold was discovered, I believe. That region was unorganized, unpatrolled, and beyond the jurisdiction of U.S. law, right?
Yes.
To use the old trapper saying, there was no law west of Leavenworth. Okay. So realizing that they were passing beyond the pale of law and aware that the tedious journey and the constant tensions of the trail brought out the worst in human character, the pioneers, you know where this is going, created their own lawmaking and law enforcing machinery before they started. Yes, people are not dumb.
Wow.
They think ahead and they make plans. They understand what they're heading into. They've heard stories. Maybe there's even, if you're not the first ones doing it, right? There's maybe reports back of what worked well on the journey out and what didn't and so forth, right? And you learn from that, right? So you iterate and you improve your rules. So like their fellow travelers on the ocean, the pioneers and their prairie schooners negotiated a plains law, much like their counterparts' sea law. The result of this negotiation in many cases was the adoption of a formal constitution patterned after that of the U.S. Constitution. So the wagon train would actually have its own constitution. So they're a little like temporary association, I guess, right? That's going to travel together. They're going to be together for a long time in hazardous circumstances. So they set up some rules, so many rules, in fact, that they go ahead and make it like a constitution for their wagon train.
Yeah. So, and you can, if you're big into American history or English history, I guess it would technically be at this time. These are very similar to like the Mayflower Compact and things like these, where you have people setting out and they're like, all right, this is our goal. This is what we're going to do. This is how we're going to act. It's not legalistic. It's very much more direct. Yeah.
It's an agreement between a company of people who are doing a joint venture together, right?
Yes.
Yeah, that's another thing. Even Tolkien doesn't handle that well, right? The adventurers set out. No, actually, I take that back. I was going to say, if you look in The Hobbit, they actually have Bilbo sign something. I forgot about that before they set out to deal with Smaug, right? He has to actually sign, and he gets 1/13 of the treasure, and his duties are such and such. And so they had the dwarves that set out to Mount, I'm sorry, not Mount Doom. What was the mountain? Was it Mount Doom? No, that's not right. Anyway, the dwarves who set out in The Hobbit had a compact together. What was it? Including with the Hobbit, who joined their company, right? So Tolkien got that right, of course. Tolkien was an anarchist, by the way. A lot of people don't know that. Okay, so I love the language, as Turnip was calling out before. There's something beautiful about the language. It actually sounds pretty well written, I have to say, Turnip, everything we've heard so far from these compacts and agreements and so forth. And as you pointed out, it feels very direct and practical. right? And
yes.
fair. So let me just read a little, because I like the sound of these things. We, the members of the Greene and Jersey County Company of Immigrants to California, for the purpose of effectually protecting our persons and property, and as the best means of ensuring an expeditious and easy journey, do ordain and establish the following Constitution. So it's got a little bit of formality, right? They're taking it very seriously, but it's plain speaking also.
It tells you who and why.
Yeah, right, that's right. Who, why, and here's what we're going to do about it. Now, this is interesting. Most often the groups waited until after they have been on the trail for a few days and out of the jurisdiction of the United States. That's funny. So I don't know what that means. Get away from the lawyers. Get a few days' journey away from the lawyers. Something like that, right?
Yeah.
Okay, the constitutions also included eligibility for voting, decision rules for amendment. So they made a way you could change the rules as they learned on the trail, right? Banishment of individuals from the group, and dissolution of the company. They actually allow the company to just, well, we're done, or this isn't working out, so we're just going to call this thing off. That's a smart thing to put in your constitution. There's some other constitutions that could have that in there. So let's read a little more from these folks. We, citizens and inhabitants of the United States and members of the Greene and Jersey County Company of Immigrants to California, about starting on a journey through a territory where the laws of our common country do not extend their protection, deem it necessary for the preservation of our rights to establish certain wholesome rules and regulations. We therefore, having first organized a constitution of government for ourselves, do now proceed to enact and ordain the following laws, and in so doing, we disclaim all desire or intention of violating or treating with disrespect the laws of our country. We're not trying to compete with you, U.S. government. Don't squash us. Yeah. Right? So they would have rules about organization of jury trials, regulation of Sabbath breaking, gambling, and intoxication, penalties for failing to perform chores, especially guard duty. In certain cases, there were even provisions for the repair of roads, building bridges, and protection of what some economists call public goods, which economists, at least for a time, or some of them still, I guess, think can't possibly be done without a monopoly government making them happen, right? But these folks do it. So these voluntary contracts provided the basis for social organization. Let's see. Yeah, the Schelling points from which the individuals negotiated included a very well accepted set of private rights, especially with regard to property. It says, oh yeah, this is expected upon leaving the legal jurisdiction of the United States with its many laws governing private property, that the immigrants would have less respect for others' rights. But that's not what we find. Even when food became so scarce that starvation was a distinct possibility, there are few examples where the pioneers resorted to violence. Yeah, you were going to say?
Why would if cowboys can keep the law pretty well going from 3 states, why would the wagon train suddenly be the exception?
Right. So let's see. How did they handle some disputes here? When crimes against person or property did occur, the judicial system, which was specified in the contracts, was brought into play. The rules of a traveling company organized at Canesville, Iowa, resolved that in case of any dispute arising between any members of the company, they shall be referred to 3 arbiters, one chosen by each party and one by the 2 chosen, whose decision shall be final. Right? So throw together a quick court, basically, right?
Mm-hmm.
Individuals crossing the plains had incentives to organize into firms with one another. Scale economies in the production of goods such as meals and services such as herding, and in the provision of protection from Indians, provided for gains from voluntary and collective action. And so it goes into some detail, and I think this is worth doing, of the mass. And what was the mass? It was individuals contributing food, oxen, wagons, labor, etc., for the joint production of travel or meals. In this way, the mass, which allowed the property to remain privately owned, differed from a partnership where property was concurrently owned. We'll talk about that in a moment. So there's different ways you can do this. You've got a joint venture together. You can pool your property and say, now we all sort of own this together. and that's the joint stock company. We'll talk about that in a sec. Mm-hmm. Or you can do the mess way of organizing, which is that I still own that. That's my horse on that wagon or whatever. And this is my food that I brought. But we put it in a common store of goods because we're going to share together. And, we've got someone who's a good cook, and we're going to provide them with raw supplies, and they're going to cook us good meals, right? Yeah. And we're going to benefit by cooperating in that way, and we'll get some scale benefits rather than each of us cooking on our own. While other chores need to be done.
And I have the right to withdraw at any time and let it be known that when we get there, if I want to go my own way, that is mine. Like I can withdraw.
That's the key thing. At any time, you can say, I'm sorry, I want my horse back and I want my grain back that hasn't been used up yet. And they've, it says when new agreements could not be reached, the mess would have to be dissolved and property returned to individual owners. Since ownership remained private, division was not difficult. So they're saying there wasn't a lot of conflict when, well, for one thing, you get to the end of the trail, hopefully, eventually, if all goes well, right?
Right.
You get to your destination and you divvy everything back out that had been sort of functioning in common while you were traveling. Mm-hmm. Or maybe before that, because somebody's like, I've gone far enough, I'm going to stop at this town, right? Okay, and then there's the joint stock company where the members contributed capital and other property, which was held concurrently. That means everybody has like a share in the company. Since the property was held concurrently, this process was more complicated to deal with disagreements and individuals leaving the company. And I'm not going to go into the detail, but it goes into some detail about what it looked like for dissolving a company. But they note all of this occurred in the absence of coercion. So even the joint stock company, even though it may be a little messier, still worked out okay. Okay, let's see. Oh yeah, there was a decision here which I thought was nice to give a flavor of how these things functioned, right? Okay, so there was 8 members of a company, the Boone County Company, and they fell into rival factions of 3 and 5, and it looked like they were going to have to break up the Boone County Company, right? Break it up into 2 groups. So negotiations continued for some time until all the company property, note that none of the private property was divided, but they had some shared company property. It was all divided between 2 groups. But they got to an impasse because the indivisibility of units and differences in quality, prices were assigned to units and the groups resolved the issue by trade. However, even after doing that, a $75 claim of the majority group proved harder to resolve. The claim resulted from the fact that a passenger who owned 2 mules and a horse and had been traveling with the company chose to take his property and go with the 3, the smaller group part, right? The disadvantaged majority demanded compensation. Unable to settle the dispute, arbitration came from a private court consisting of 3 disinterested men, 1 chosen by each side, a 3rd chosen by both. And here's their decision. So here we go. Ready? Let's see if you can understand the lawyerese out on the frontier. Mm-hmm. We can see no just cause why the mess of 3 men should pay anything to the mess of 5 men, it being a mutual and simultaneous agreement to dissolve the original contract. The fact that Abbott joins in with the 3 men does not alter, in our opinion, the matter of the case. For the dissolution being mutually agreed upon, all the parties stand in the same relation to each other, which they did before any contract was entered into. Abbott might or not, just as he chose, unite with either party. If he chose to unite with neither party, then clearly neither could claim of the other. If he united with a foreign party, then who could think of claiming anything of such a party? Mm-hmm. So it sounds like very sound legal reasoning, right? Yeah. And it's just folks. The important point of this example is that when the Boone County Company could not renegotiate its initial contract, the members did not resort to force, but chose private arbitration instead. It says, the many companies which crossed the plains, some proved inadequate to meet all emergencies, but the ease with which the members could dissolve their bonds and form new associations without lawlessness and disorder proves the true democratic spirit among the American frontiersmen rather than the opposite. Competition rather than coercion ensured justice. Okay, last thing I have on the wagon trains. The wagon trains on the overland trails, summing it up, did provide protection and justice without a monopoly on coercion, did allow competition to produce rules, and did not result in the lawless disorder generally associated with anarchy. Okay, any concluding thoughts on the wagon trains?
Yeah, so two potential objections that you might come across to this idea is going to be the very infamous Donner Party, which didn't stay orderly for long. And
were they a wagon train?
Unless I have gone completely wrong, I believe they were a wagon train that took a shortcut on the way to California and got snowed in between mountains and had to eat each other. The cannibals, not by choice, but necessity, quote unquote. And the other one would be the Baker-Fancher wagon train, which crossed through Utah and had everyone above the age of 8 shot and killed, and the Mormons kidnapped the rest. So what about these two? Well, the first one, the Donner Party, was a group of people that all agreed to go onto one risky shortcut, quote unquote, to get to California faster. While it was disorderly, they got there with mutual agreement. No one forced them to go along with the Donner Party and get killed. The second one, where the Mormons basically slaughtered an entire wagon train. What happened there? Well, so this is the Mountain Meadows Massacre. You might know it by that name. Well, obviously the wagon trains have failed. Well, no, this one failed because if you're to believe the Latter-day Saints, apparently it's a great miscommunication that somehow resolved into a very orderly way of executing everyone above the age of 8. But
wow,
in the reality, what happened here? Well, that wagon train did not plan for itself adequate defenses, and they came across crazy people, and this is what happened. This was the risk that they all agreed upon. No one, they on their own volition traveled through Utah during a time period known as the Mormon Wars, or the Western Wars, depending on who you ask. So it's dangerous. Just because there is mutual agreement does not mean that the danger is gone. It just means that no one's being coerced into doing it.
Taking on the risk. Right?
Yeah. That being said, if you're going to travel through a war-torn area, you should probably take either more people with guns or heavier hitting guns. And that was the issue with the Baker-Fancher train.
Right.
Both of which
not exactly failures of self-organization.
Exactly.
But
yes.
We fully acknowledge. I mean, part of the reason it is interesting to look at the Old West is we fully acknowledge that it was on the edges, or just playing way beyond anything like civilization. And humans are vulnerable in such situations, right? Yes, and so it was risky. Everyone knew when they headed out into the frontier areas
they could die.
They were taking a risk just by doing it.
Yes. Yeah. And
no matter how well they organized and prepared.
Yeah, and like that's no one could have planned for the Mountain Meadows Massacre. Like that's how crazy it gets. Like you all get shot and your children get kidnapped and inducted into a cult. Like you can't plan for some things. This is just what happens. But at least these people had the liberty to take that risk, which we no longer have. You don't have that opportunity anymore. To me, I would rather be then than now. But that's not a really unpopular opinion in these parts.
Take your chances. Yeah. Okay, now, are you hard out in 5 minutes?
Nope. Okay. That was an estimate. I am good to go for quite a while.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, just a concluding section here, and then anything else you wanted to share on this topic. So shall I do the concluding section?
Yeah, go ahead. I've got time.
Okay, right. So the just to wrap up the paper, and coming back to some of the hypotheses from David Friedman, right? Here's some conclusions that are consistent with his hypotheses. First, the West was, for the most part, orderly, the Old West. That's not the picture we get from the movies, but that's what we learn from the historians, the better history that's been done recently. And I don't know if you caught it, but early in the paper, they're just building on the work of historians, and they're just pulling it together and sort of making this kind of political theory point, right? But they're not. I maybe in the book they did a lot more original research, but this is heavily footnoted. I think to a great degree they were just saying, "Wow, we've been looking at the digging that historians have been doing on the Old West, and it looks really different when you look at the actual original sources and people do the good, hard revisionist history work, right?"
Yeah.
And so they just kind of summarize it in this paper and then later in the book. But the historians were already figuring it out. And this is something we've run into this before. You might remember my favorite show one of my favorite shows of this series, the Industrial Revolution of the Middle Ages. I gave a very different picture of the Middle Ages than a lot of people have, but people who are actually historians of that in that field know this. It just hasn't made it out to the general public. And that's true in a lot of these cases. We've got a cartoon version of history, and people who actually know the scholarship know that cartoon version is at least in part wrong and sometimes just completely bass-backwards, right?
Yeah.
But most people don't know it because it takes a long time for scholarship to make it out to the general populace. And when the scholarship goes against the regime narrative, it may never make it out to the general populace, right? It'll just stay with the historians. So anyway, the West was, for the most part, orderly. That's one of the main things I want you to take away from the show today. Second, different standards of justice and various preferences for rules happened, right? So that's another big takeaway here, that diversity. I like to call it genuine diversity, right? Different people finding different ways to adapt to different circumstances, right? And potentially probably flavored by their own cultural sort of assumptions, that Schelling point stuff, right? Just the things that they unconsciously maybe held in common. They didn't sit there and go, let's reason out property rights starting from John Locke, They just do what seemed right to them, right?
Yes.
That's kind of what the Schelling point means, I think, to some degree. It's just something that was in their bones, so to speak, in their culture. They knew what seemed right, and they just
they defaulted to that.
Yeah, they defaulted to that, and based on those shared assumptions about how the world works, they were able to put together rules that worked and produce order in a situation that could have been crazy and is depicted as crazy, but in real life wasn't crazy, right?
Right.
3, competition in defending and adjudicating rights has beneficial effects. Now, this is something that's really confusing for people who don't know economics, partially because we use the word competition, which is in some ways unfortunate, because market competition is not like sports competition.
Yeah, I was about to say, I blame the public school system for polluting the word competition.
Exactly. Yeah, right. Well, sports and also maybe war, right? All of these things, if you see people writing about the market, business writers, Wall Street Journal types and stuff, you'll see them use like war language,
Yeah.
And the language of domination, and all this stuff. I mean, I'm sure it makes it more exciting reading, but it's also less accurate description, because in the market, we're competing to cooperate, if you follow, right? It's a little different than like when the end of this game is over, one team or whatever will be victorious and the other will be weeping and ground into the dust, right? That's not exactly how the market works. It's more, maybe a better way of talking about it is it's the process of everybody finding a good fit, right?
Yes.
Where do I fit in this world? Where
mutual benefit? Yeah.
Yeah. Where can I serve my fellow man in a way that works for other people and works for me too, right? And so the process of free cooperation guides you towards good ways of cooperating and even what your role should be, right? And so we talk about, in a situation like this, they talked about 3 adjudicators or whatever, one picked by one picked by the other, another that they both chose. Well, I bet you if a number of those sorts of adjudications happened, I bet you that sometimes that third guy they'd end up picking the same guy. He started to build a reputation. He was fair-minded, he was practical, he was common sense, and everybody, after he explained his reasoning, everybody nodded their head and they said, "Yep, he's right. That's the right way to think about it." Right? He just naturally starts finding his place and earning respect. Right? That's competition. Right? It's kind of a lousy word for what the process really is.
Yeah. If you want to put it into biology terms, you will fill your niche. Like,
right.
You will find something you can do, right. Or in religious terms, your vocation.
Vocation, yeah. Right. So am I in competition with, Bill Gates or LeBron James or whatever? Well, I don't know in what sense you mean. I mean, they found what they do, and I found what I do.
Are you in the business of basketball or buying up farmland?
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. Hey, maybe he can privatize all that federal land out west. That might be better. I don't know. Okay. So even when these market alternatives did become governments in the sense of having a virtual monopoly on coercion, the fact, and now here comes our Don Livingston, learn that name, the fact that such firms were usually quite small provided significant checks on their behavior. Clients could leave or originate protective agencies on their own. Without formal legal sanctions, the private agencies did face a market test, and the rate of survival of such agencies was much less than under government.
Yeah.
Right? So let's break that apart. This is tremendous couple sentences here. Human scale, right? It's not so big that the thought of trying to get away from it is like, I'll have to leave everything I know and people who speak my language to get away from this tyranny, right? It's more like, I'll move over to the street over, and I think the way they run their neighborhood's better.
Yeah.
That's the scale that is more fitting and more natural. Did you want to comment on the scale?
Yeah, and then usually at this time as well, like if you don't like how something is done, you can literally go and build what you think should be done in a better way. Like it's not all taken up yet. And to an extent, in most of these Great Plains states, you can still do that today. It's just now you have the ever watching eyes of the federal government and its multiple like hellspawn watching after you.
Right. So some people do the love it. If you don't love the United States, then just get out of here. You're a traitor.
Love it or leave it.
Love it or leave it. If you didn't like us invading Iraq, then you clearly don't love America.
Yeah.
Actually, let me make that more spicy. If you didn't like us invading Iraq for Israel, you clearly don't love America.
It is the patriotic duty of Americans to go to Iraq and shoot their women and children.
Yeah, exactly. Right. So that attitude. It's crazy and tyrannical, right? And much more reasonable is that things are on a small enough scale that you just, you leave one association, you join another. It's not a big deal. It's like if the government wasn't making it a big deal, it wouldn't be a big deal. I mean, you'd be like, maybe you'd feel sad because you felt like you guys got along pretty good, and then he left and decided to join another group, not the one you had started maybe, and you're kind of feeling, you're like, you feel a little hurt personally, right?
Yeah.
But this is quite different than, massive slaughters and civil wars, right?
Yeah. And something else is like, this isn't like, if you're talking about different rules for like mining communities or things along those lines, it does not have to be vitriolic for you to leave. It doesn't have to be some deep-seated feud that I hate you all, I'm going to go build my own now. It's more like, I think I'll do better on my own out there. Like we're still associated. It's just I'm going to do my own now. And then people will be like, all right, go. Good luck.
Yeah, right. Did they have wars of ideology in the mining camps, where the left-wing mining camp said, no one from the right-wing mining camp can be allowed to live with the horrible ideas they have, right?
All right.
All must be slaughtered down to the baby suckling at his mother's breast, Okay, yeah. Anyway. Okay, yeah. And furthermore, just to break this out, they face a market test. And note this, the rate of survival of such agencies was much less than under government. Well, what does he mean? Ronald Reagan had a great line, right? That I'm not going to get it right, but something about the longest lived thing in the world is a government agency or something like that.
Nothing is more permanent than a temporary or a
thank you.
Temporary agency.
Yeah. Or a temporary program or something like government program, something like that. Yeah, right. So it's well known that once you get a precedent in the monopoly government, dislodging it, it's like nearly impossible. I mean, it happens occasionally, right? But it's nearly impossible once they get going with the precedent. They seize a certain new power over us. Getting them to give it up again is extremely difficult, right? And so you get this unnaturally long survival of institutions. Now, why do I say unnatural? Because what we've been seeing here, right, is that these private institutions were adaptive to circumstances, and I suspect to time. And some of these, mining communities lasted longer than I expected when it talked about lasting even after the state government was there and stuff like that. But eventually it outlived its purpose and they dissolved it, and that's okay, right?
Yeah. Or like we mentioned earlier in the stream, if one's getting unjust, a new one's going to take its place because people like the just one more. Like
something fair, yeah.
Yeah, the ones that are unfit are going to stop working, die out. They're going to be dysfunctional. They're going to be outcompeted or replaced by something that will work better. And they're allowed to do that. You can't do that with the U.S. government right now, or most governments on the earth. You just can't, like, the Social Security system has outlived its purpose. It's bad, blah, blah, blah. You can go through 5 million different reasons. I can't say I'm going to stop using this. Stop contributing, we're going to get rid of it and replace it with our own competing one. You can't do that.
I'm sorry, I realized I told my wife, oh yeah, Turnip's going to have to leave at 5:45, so I'll be able to take the children at 6. Okay, so I have 8 minutes. So I am not going to cover the 2 examples of civil disorder. I'll just mention them, turn to the paper. Oh, I never shared the paper. Okay, give me a sec. Wow, how did I manage to do this? Usually I always share my links. So I want the Wild West. It is, of course, a link at the Mises Institute. Is this the right one? No, I don't want that one. I want this one. Okay, yeah, there we go. Here's a link in the chat to the paper. And you can read about 2 counterexamples where things did not go well, 2 examples of civil disorder out in the Old West that were fairly tragic, and see what you think. But I'm going to skip that and for lack of time, and just say, especially when Schelling points were lacking, disorder and chaos resulted, lending to Buchanan's contention that agreement on initial rights is important to anarcho-capitalism. When this agreement existed, however, we have presented evidence that anarcho-capitalism was viable on the frontier. Okay, so I'm going to bring that down and check my various chats so we can respond to those real quick. Where's the other one? There we go.
So, okay. Radlin, should we do a follow-up stream called Decline of the West, where we talk about how all of this stuff gets dismantled?
Yeah, now you probably know something about that, and I don't. So that could be quite interesting, actually.
I just thought the name could be funny, The Decline and Fall of the West.
Right, yeah, right. That's a good one, yeah. Okay, Ratface, thank you, gives a super chat. Have you considered doing an episode about usury? Yeah, that's an interesting topic. I'm actually reading that big monster book. If you follow me on Twitter, I've been sort of live tweeting it sometimes when I'm working on it, sharing passages that strike me or I think are funny or whatever. And it does get into usury a bit. And of course, there's Tom Woods has dealt with this heavily in The Church and the Market, because of course that's a big concern for Catholics. You know, by endorsing the market, aren't you endorsing usury? And Tom Woods goes through the history there of how the thinking developed over time among like the scholastics and so forth. That was also covered when I did the Spanish monks episode recently. I covered usury there to some degree. But I guess if I was really going to do it, I would read E. Michael Jones' darn book and then tear it apart. but I don't know. I think somebody would have to pay me to do that kind of work. But go ahead.
The Lutheran Church Missouri Synod has a bunch of writings on usury because the Lutheran reformers, at the very least, were very divided on the issue, and then sometimes they would come to a consensus, and then things would change, and then you'd have. That was something I've been trying to read into. So
yeah, there's some great material, and the scholastics the Spanish scholastics really got there, in my view. Got to the right view of this. Adrianus Cornett says, "What is your opinion on the right to repair?" I don't know what that means. Do you?
No, not without assuming things. No,
right to repair. Learn about. Okay, learn about the right to repair. The Repair Association. This is your right to repair. Repair rights. Yeah, but what is it? Wow. Nobody says.
Someone in the chat says. Yeah, someone in the chat says it has to do with mobile phones. So perhaps you purchase something from a company and they say you can only get it repaired from us. You can't repair it on your own.
This is from repair.org. Why do we need right to repair? The presence of technology parts and modern equipment has enabled manufacturers to reduce access to repair by proclaiming that repair might violate their proprietary rights. This is a marketing ruse and not grounded in law. Manufacturers do not have any rights to control property beyond the sale. Limitations on repair become a serious problem for all modern equipment that also limits how equipment can be traded on the used market.
Yeah. Sounds like a problem with IP laws.
Yeah, that's a good point. Intellectual property is probably complicating it. And intellectual property is completely bogus, which I haven't done a show on, but I should. In fact, I bet you I could get Stefan Kinsella. He's working on a new book on it, he told me. I bet you I could get him, maybe once he has that book out, the thing to do would be to have him on to kind of pitch the book, And he's going to improve on his excellent book that I always recommend, he told me. I got to see him at the Mises Institute. Anyway, good stuff. Okay, well, that's that. And I better find my children and get them to karate. I think we've covered everything. Support us on Subscribestar. Thank you so much, Turnip, for jumping in with somewhat short notice with Rhetoric's absence. You were exactly the right person to cover this topic. And you make an excellent point about we're basically talking about the relative order before the state got involved, right? And the sort of pre or extra outside of the state situation, right? Well, eventually the state came to the West.
Yeah, and it really screwed things up, let me tell you.
And that's a whole story. And I have heard about the conflicts with ranchers and water rights. I've seen the occasional article, but I just don't have the context to fully appreciate that story. So that might be one for us to come back to and sort of take this story to the next part, which it would almost be overlapping, right? Depending on which part of the geography you're talking about.
Yeah.
1830 is what, the Kentucky is a state at that point or whatever, right? And then 1890, finally, you've got some of the last of the West becoming states. So it's not so much a period of time, it's a condition.
It's a process,
It's when the frontier becomes taken over by the United States federal government, basically, right? Yep. Once they get out there and are able to exercise effective control, what are the results of that? And that does sound like a really interesting story. It would be sort of like, this is the rise that we talked about today. And as you suggested, we tell the story of the decline of the West, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, sir. And I think we're done.
Yeah,
all right.
Thank you for having me, Rod.
Great job. All right. Thanks, Turnip.